So take a guess. Who automatically likes their own gender more? Is it men or is it women? Remarkably, it's women, even though high status groups usually show more in-group bias. So here's the results of 3 separate experiments at Rutgers and Purdue using the gender attitude IAT. I'm just reminding you that a D-score of 0.8 is a strong in-group bias. And what do we see for women? They have in the orange bars, here's 0.8, and in every experiment, women exceeded a large effect size. They really prefer women over men. But what about the guys? Here's the 0 mark, no bias, and that's pretty much where the men are located, sort of neutral in terms of their gender attitudes. They're not showing in-group bias, they're showing a little bit here, but mostly their responses are neutral. Are you surprised? Well, we were shocked. Women show 5 times more in-group bias than men. And while we replicated that in the US, other researchers have replicated that finding in Germany, England, and Switzerland. So, why do you think that is? Well, consider that we first learn to love those who nurture and protect us, and think about who typically raises both men and women. It's mothers, right? So maybe the love for the woman who got there first and often, does that sort of push implicit gender attitudes in a pro-female direction? It does. People primarily raised by their mothers also showed pro-female bias on the gender attitude IAT, and they also preferred their moms to their dads on the parent IAT. By contrast, explicit gender attitudes are unaffected by our parents. People don't think about their mom and dad when asked to rate their liking for men and women, but it has an influence over our automatic system. So this suggests that emotions, even though stemming from developmental events, even pre-verbal, our pre-verbal childhood, it suggests that they influence system 1 more so than system 2. For men, in-group bias, which would be pro-male, works against maternal attachment, which is pro-female, which could help to explain why their implicit attitudes are neutral. They kind of have competing automatic associations going on there, and they sort of wash each other out. But in addition, men are more likely to show pro-female attitudes to the extent that they like sex, which is another emotional source of implicit attitudes. More broadly, what about physical affection? Who's allowed to kiss and hug their own gender more, men or women? Of course, it's women. In Western nations, men are socialized to be relatively wary of and distance from their fellow man, largely to avoid the stigma of being misclassified as gay. But also consider that boys and men often experience physical and verbal abuse at the hands of their own gender. Bullying is not an uncommon phenomenon for boys, and then being sort of harassed as men can continue into their adult life, right? And that's because they're constantly being challenged to prove their masculinity, and aggression is a way of doing that, as we will learn in detail later on. So if you consider that this happens to men and to boys over time, it's easy to see how that could prevent men from bonding with their own gender, right? Their amygdala lights up when they interact with other men. Am I going to be challenged for not being man enough here? Or is somebody going to punch me just to tease me? And in fact, our research shows that both genders associate women with trust and men with danger. And the trust IAT correlated with the gender attitude IAT. So again, that helps to explain why men showed weaker gender in-group bias than women. Remarkably, though, the pattern contradicts social identity theory. Both genders should favor their own group to the same extent, and also intergroups relations theories by which high status groups should show stronger in-group bias. And that's again proving that gender as a social category is special indeed. So far, we've identified 3 reasons why men's in-group bias is far weaker than women's: maternal attachment, sexual gratification, trustworthiness. So women are wonderful. No matter how you measure gender attitudes, women are favored over men, but there's a catch, except when they are in charge, in which case women are resisted. So would that be true of implicit attitudes as well? To find out, Rudman and Kiliansky gave people a different implicit measure. In our study, participants categorized good and bad adjectives such as clever, honest, incompetent, or annoying, bitter, and careless with schematic figures of men and women in high versus low authority roles. What do I mean by schematic figures? Pictures like this. Female authorities were like doctors, police officer, but also we had female dentists, judges, professor, and a businesswoman. Low authority females were this homemaker who's cooking something, as well as a waitress, and we had a maid, a hairdresser, a shopper, and a model. Male authorities were, again, a doctor and a businessman, but also dentist, judge, professor, and male police officer. And low authority males were this guy cooking as well as a waiter, in addition to a bartender, a model, a hairdresser, and a phone operator. So how we scored this measure was we took the speed difference between categorizing each type of stimulus with bad words versus categorizing each type of stimulus with good words, such that a high score means greater implicit prejudice toward each of the 4 types of people: male high authority figures, female high authority figures, male low authority figures, and female low authority figures. And as with the IAT, 0 means no bias. So here's what we found. The green bars are reactions to female in high authority positions, our doctors, our police officers, and so forth. And what we found is both genders are prejudiced against female authority figures. They found it easier to categorize those schematic figures with negative words like bitter and annoying compared with positive words like competent. So no gender difference, although men's mean is a little bit higher. It tells you something about automatic associations for men and women don't differ when it comes to high authority women. And then for male authorities, both genders scored the same. They scored as neutral. So they found it just as easy to associate these figures with good words as with bad words. And then the gender differences came with the low authority stimulus, such that men were not too happy with women in low authority figures. We sort of call these 2 bars together an indication that men were sort of automatically sexist. And then for women, they were neutral towards low authority women, but they actually liked male authority figures, whereas guys, they didn't particularly like them. But the key finding here comes with the green bars showing no gender difference in prejudice against female authority figures. To summarize, both men and women automatically showed more negativity towards female than male authority figures. By contrast, using self-reports, women reported more liking for female authority figures than men did. For example, they were more likely to agree with statements like, "I would vote for a female president," which in 2016 we found that to be true. There was a very big gender gap in voting for Hillary Clinton, as well as "I seek out female doctors." So women are implicitly liked more than men, provided they aren't in charge. Because women's status is lower, it is harder for them to gain acceptance in powerful roles. It's nobody's fault. The gender system is set up this way. We learn it as part of our cultural heritage. So, true confession, I was inspired to do this study because I was on a plane experiencing a lot of turbulence. The turbulence was so bad, there were members of the Rutgers football team who were heaving quite violently. The pilot's voice, a low baritone, came over the intercom to assure us that everything was fine, and I did feel instantly assured. But after we landed safely and I gathered my wits about me, I had to stop and wonder, what if the pilot had been a woman? Like, what if her voice had been higher when she was assuring us that everything was fine? I wondered if I would have felt quite as relieved. And here's another true confession. I was on a different plane talking with a woman who complained that her boss was flying to Italy while she had to go to Sacramento. So I asked her, well, what does he do? She snorted at me, my boss is a she. And I just felt horrible. I'm like the feminist who failed the riddle test, which was used during the 1970s to demonstrate implicit gender bias. Maybe you're familiar with this riddle, maybe you're not, but here it is. A doctor walks into a surgical theater and says, I can't operate on him. He is my son. The doctor is not the father, so how can this be? And the answer, of course, is that, I'll tell you, the doctor is the boy's mother. And people were flunking out on this test over and over again, even feminists, in order to show us how deeply ingrained the idea that men have authority in our culture and women do not. Okay, it's not just me. My very first year at Rutgers, I was teaching Intro to Social Psych, and my TA was Steve Kiliansky, who was a non-traditional PhD student of mine, meaning we were about the same age, both of us kind of up there in years. Before class, we both stood by the podium, and the students all came up to him with their questions, assuming he was the professor and I was the TA. So the point is, we all suffer from these automatic associations, no matter how egalitarian our values, because our culture teaches us that men have higher standing than women. So for your next assignment, consider how the media plays a huge role in teaching us about gender stereotypes, roles, and hierarchy. It's one of the reasons why we constantly get practice at associating men with high status and women with low status occupations or interests, talents, etc., is because the media is constantly reinforcing that. All right, I'll be excited to learn what you find out in your media assignment.